He didn't know when it started. That's what Josiah Kemp would tell you if you asked him, which no one did because no one was close enough to hear it, and the people who were close enough, dubbed Farnsworth 4 miles south, the Crow families who camped along the Musselshell in summer, knew better than to ask a man about the things he does when he thinks he's alone. But if someone had asked, Josiah would have said he didn't know when the singing started. It came the way most habits come on the frontier, not as a decision but as a drift, the way snow drifts against a fence or silt drifts along a creek bed, slowly and without permission, and then one day it's there, and it has been there so long you can't remember the time before it. He bought the horse in the spring of 1878, a buckskin mare, 5 years old, either from a Crow trader at the Musselshell River crossing. He paid $12 and a skinning knife, and the trader threw in a rope halter and a story about the mare's mother being the fastest horse in the Yellowstone Valley, which Josiah didn't believe, but appreciated the way you appreciate any story that comes free with a purchase. The mare wasn't fast. She was steady. She had a walk that covered ground without appearing to hurry, and a temperament that did not change regardless of what was happening around her. Storms, river crossings, cattle that spooked and scattered, the particular chaos of a roundup when every horse in the string was wide-eyed and hot except Pearl, who stood in the middle of it all with the expression of an animal that had seen everything at least twice and was not impressed. He named her Pearl because her coat in the early morning light, before the dust of the day settled on it, had a pale gold sheen that reminded him of the pearl-handled knife his mother had kept in the kitchen in Virginia. His mother had been dead since he was 19, and the knife was long gone, and the memory was the kind that surfaces only when something catches the light at the right angle and triggers the part of the brain where childhood lives, buried but not gone. He named the horse, and the name stuck, and the horse answered to it the way good horses answer to their names, not with obedience, but with acknowledgement, a turn of the ear, a shift of the weight, the subtle communication between an animal and the only voice it hears every day. The singing started sometime in the first year. He was 28 and living alone on a ranch he had built with his own hands at the foot of the Little Belt Mountains, running 60 head of cattle on open range in the Judith Basin, and the evenings were long and the silence was the kind that has texture, the kind you can feel on your skin like cold or humidity. He would finish the work and come to the corral, and Pearl would be standing at the fence the way she always was, her head over the top rail, her ears forward, waiting for the handful of oats he brought from the barn. He would give her the oats and brush her neck and stand there in the last light with his hand on her mane and the mountains turning purple behind them and the first stars coming out over the basin. And at some point, he truly could not say when, he began to sing. Not well. Josiah Kemp was not a singer the way some cowboys were, the men who could carry a melody across a campfire and make the other hands stop talking and listen. His voice was rough and low and tended to wander off the tune the way a calf wanders off the trail, not out of rebellion, but out of simple unfamiliarity with where it was supposed to go. He sang the songs his mother had sung in Virginia, hymns mostly, and a few folk songs about rivers and roads and the people who traveled them. He sang them quietly, standing at the corral fence with his hand on Pearl's neck, and the horse stood still and listened, or seemed to listen, her breathing slow and even, her eyes half closed, the way horses stand when they are at peace with the world and the person in it. He sang every night for 15 years. Through the winters when the temperature dropped to 30 below and the snow piled to the corral rails, and he had to break the ice on the water trough with an axe before he could sing, because the singing didn't happen until the chores were done, and the chores included the ice. Through the springs when the creek flooded, and the calves came, and the days were 18 hours long, and the singing happened at 10 or 11 at night, under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Through the summers when the grass was tall and the sky stayed light until 10 o'clock, and the singing happened in a golden haze of dust and warmth. Through the falls when the cottonwoods turned yellow, and the elk came down from the mountains, and the air smelled like frost and sage and the end of something. 15 years, the same horse, the same corral, the same songs, worn smooth from repetition, the way stones are worn smooth by water, the words losing their edges, the melodies becoming something closer to humming, the singing becoming less about music and more about the act itself, the nightly conversation between a man who had no one to talk to and a horse that had learned to expect the sound of his voice the way it expected oats and water and the brush on its neck. Dub Farnsworth heard it once. He had ridden up in the dark to return a steer that had wandered south, and he came around the barn and saw Josiah standing at the corral fence in the moonlight singing to the mare, and he stopped his horse and sat in the saddle and listened for a full minute before clearing his throat and announcing himself. He never mentioned it. Not because it was strange. Men on the frontier did far stranger things to keep the silence at bay, but because it was private, and Dub Farnsworth was a man who understood that privacy is the one thing you can give a neighbor that costs you nothing and means everything. The years went by the way years go in the Judith Basin, marked not by dates, but by winters. Each winter a chapter, each spring a new page. The calendar measured in hay and ice, and the slow aging of a horse that had been young and was now not. Pearl at 10 was still strong and steady. Pearl at 15 was slower, her walk shorter, her mornings stiffer, the way mornings get stiff for anything that has carried weight for a long time. Pearl at 18 was an old horse by any measure, and her muzzle gray, and her ribs more visible than they used to be, and her eyes carrying the particular softness that old horses get, the look of an animal that has traded speed for wisdom and is satisfied with the exchange. Josiah at 43 was not so different. His own mornings were stiffer, his own walk was shorter. The ranch was the same size, but it felt larger every year because the body that worked it was getting smaller, the way all bodies get smaller against the land when the land stays the same, and the body does not. He had lived in the Judith Basin for 15 years, and in that time he had spoken to Dub Farnsworth, to the cattle buyers who came through twice a year, to the storekeeper in town when he rode in for supplies, and to Pearl. If you added up all the words he had spoken to humans in 15 years, they would not equal the number of songs he had sung to the horse. This is not an exaggeration. This is the mathematics of solitude, and the frontier was full of men who could do the same arithmetic. The night it happened was a Tuesday in October of 1893. The cottonwoods were yellow, and the first frost had come the week before, and the air had the particular sharpness that October air has in Montana. The feeling of a blade being drawn slowly across the skin of the year. Josiah finished the evening chores. He broke the thin ice on the trough. He fed the chickens. He stacked the wood he had split that afternoon. He walked to the corral with the handful of oats, and Pearl was standing at the fence the way she always was, her head over the rail, her ears forward, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. He gave her the oats. He brushed her neck. He stood with his hand on her mane and the mountains dark against the sky and the stars beginning to show, and he opened his mouth to sing and nothing came out, not because he was sick, not because his voice had failed, because something in him had shifted in the way that things shift when they have been held in the same position for too long, a bone, a beam, a belief. He opened his mouth and the song was there, in his head. The same hymn he had sung 1,000 times, but the distance between his head and his throat had become a canyon, and the song would not cross it. He stood at the fence and tried again, and the silence came out instead. The silence that had been waiting behind the singing for 15 years, the way darkness waits behind a candle, patient and certain and ready. He went inside. He told himself he was tired. He told himself he would sing tomorrow. He ate his supper and banked the stove and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds the ranch made at night. The wind on the roof, the creak of the barn, the creek running over the stones, and realized that the sound he was listening for, the sound that was not there, was Pearl's breathing at the corral fence. She always stood at the fence for a while after the singing, settling, the way a person settles after a conversation. Tonight the fence was silent. He woke at dawn and went to the corral and the gate was open, not broken, open. The latch was a simple wooden bar that rested in 2 brackets, and it was lifted and set aside on the post, the way Josiah himself lifted it every morning. Pearl was not in the corral. She was not in the barn. She was not in the pasture behind the barn, where she sometimes grazed in the early morning, when the dew was on the grass and the light was new. She was gone. He saddled his second horse, a young bay gelding he used for cattle work, and rode out looking for her. He followed the creek north because horses follow water, and the creek ran north toward the Judith River and the open basin beyond. He rode for 3 hours. He found her tracks in the soft ground along the bank, the distinctive prints of an unshod horse walking steady and unhurried, the stride of an animal that was not running away but going somewhere, following something, moving with the kind of purpose that animals have when they are answering a call that humans cannot hear. The tracks led north along the creek for 2 miles and then turned east toward the open basin, and then he lost them in the hard grass of the flats where the ground was dry and the hooves left no mark. He rode in circles. He called her name. He rode to the ridge line and looked out across the Judith Basin, miles of grass and sage and the slow curves of the river, and he could not see her. A buckskin horse in a golden landscape, invisible the way anything is invisible when it returns to the color it came from. He rode to Dub Farnsworth's place. Dub was on the porch with coffee, the way he always was at 8 in the morning, and he saw Josiah's face and set the cup down and said, "What happened?" "Pearl's gone. Gate was open this morning." She walked out. Dub looked at him the way a man looks at another man, when he knows the words being said are not the whole of what is being felt. "Horses don't open gates, Josiah." This one did. The latch was lifted clean, set on the post. Could be someone came through. Drifter? Could be. Nobody came through. No other tracks. Just hers. They rode out together and searched the basin for 2 days. Dub brought his hand Lyle Coogan, and the 3 of them rode the creeks and the ridge lines and the coulees where an old horse might shelter, and they found nothing. No tracks after the flats. No sign. An old buckskin mare who had spent 20 years in the Judith Basin had walked out of a corral, opened the gate herself, or been opened by something that left no footprints. And disappeared into the landscape she had carried a man across for 15 years. On the second evening, Dub and Josiah sat on the porch of Josiah's ranch and drank whiskey and watched the sun go down behind the little belts, the way they had watched it go down 100 times. And Dub said the thing that needed saying because Josiah would not say it himself. "Lyle told me about the singing. He heard you last spring when he was here for the roundup. Said you sang to her every night at the fence." Josiah looked at his hands. "Been doing it 15 years. And last night, the night before she left, The silence that came from Josiah was the same silence that had come from his throat at the corral fence. Not empty, full of the thing he could not say, which was that he had failed to do the one thing the horse expected of him, the one thing that was not food or water or shelter, but was somehow more important than all of them, the nightly proof that she was not alone, and that the man on the other side of the fence was still there, still present, still willing to make a sound in the silence for no reason, except that she was listening. "I couldn't sing," he said. "I opened my mouth and it wouldn't come. I don't know why." Dub drank his whiskey. He was not a man who offered explanations for things that didn't have them, but he was a man who understood horses, and he was a man who understood loneliness, and he said, "A horse that has been sung to for 15 years knows the difference between a night when the singing stops, because the man is tired, and a night when the singing stops, because something in the man has changed. She didn't leave because you didn't sing. Josiah. She left because she heard the silence, and the silence told her something the singing never did." Josiah thought about that for a long time. He thought about it through the rest of October and into November, when the snow came and the basin turned white and the corral stood empty and the evening chores ended without a song because there was no one to sing to. He thought about what Dub had said, and he decided that Dub was both right and wrong. Right that the horse had heard something in the silence. Wrong about what it was. The silence wasn't a change. The silence was the truth. 15 years of singing had been 15 years of holding something together. Himself, his life, the thread that connected him to another living thing in a valley where the nearest voice was 4 miles away. The singing was the rope. And when the rope broke, the horse did not fall. The horse walked away, because the horse had never needed the rope. The horse had stayed for the singing, and when the singing stopped, the staying stopped. And what was left was a man in a corral with an empty halter, and the understanding that the thing he had been holding on to had been holding on to him just as much. And now they were both standing in the open with nothing between them and the silence. He found her in December, or rather, Lyle Coogan found her. The young hand was riding fence on Dub's South Range and saw a buckskin horse standing in a grove of cottonwoods along the Judith River, 6 miles north of Josiah's ranch, standing still with her head up and her ears forward and the look of an animal that was waiting. Lyle rode to Josiah and told him, and Josiah saddled the bay and rode north and found her in the grove, exactly as Lyle described. She was thinner. Her winter coat was thick and rough, and her ribs showed under it, and she had the particular stillness of a horse that has been standing in one place for a while, not lost but decided, the way old animals decide where they want to be when the deciding is all they have left. Josiah dismounted and walked to her and put his hand on her neck, and the mare turned her head and pressed her muzzle against his chest, the way she used to press it against the corral fence, looking for the oats, looking for the brush, looking for the sound. He stood in the cottonwood grove with his hand on her neck, and the river running cold beside them, and the Montana sky gray and low, and the snow falling in the kind of thin, quiet flakes that come when the clouds are high and the cold is deep. And he sang, not because he planned to, not because he decided to, because the song came back the way it had left, without announcement, without permission, rising from the same place it had always lived, the place below the thinking, where the body keeps the things it needs. And his voice went out into the cold air, and the mare's ears came forward, and her breathing slowed, and the world narrowed to the two of them, the way it had been narrowed every evening for 15 years at the corral fence. He led her home. She followed him the way she had always followed him, steady and unhurried. Her hooves in the snow, making the sound that horse hooves make in snow, soft and rhythmic, a kind of music in itself. He put her in the barn and gave her oats and hay and warm water, and he stood with her until the light went, and the lantern was the only brightness left. That night he sang at the corral fence, even though she was in the barn. He sang to the empty corral and the dark mountains and the silence that had swallowed his voice in October and given it back in December. He sang because the singing had never been about the horse. It had been about the man. The horse was the reason, but the man was the need. And when the need stopped, the reason walked away, and the walking was the horse's way of saying what Dub Farnsworth had said with words. That silence tells the truth that singing covers up. And the truth was that Josiah Kemp needed to make a sound in the dark, or the dark would take him the way it takes everything that goes quiet on the frontier. Pearl lived 3 more years. She died in the spring of 1896, on a warm morning in April, when the grass was new and the creek was running high and the basin was green in a way that made the winter feel like a story someone told you rather than something you survived. Josiah buried her under the cottonwoods by the creek where she liked to stand in the summer shade. And that evening, he walked to the corral and stood at the fence and sang the hymn his mother had sung in Virginia, the one about gathering at the river. And his voice went out into the April dark, and there was no one to hear it except the mountains and the stars, and the memory of a horse that had taught a man that the sound of his own voice was the only thing keeping him from disappearing into the silence that surrounded him on every side. He sang every night after that, not to Pearl, not to anyone, to the corral and the dark and the space where she used to stand. Because the singing had never been about who was listening. It had been about who was making the sound. And as long as the sound was there, the man was there, and the frontier had not won.